Hello there, sword friends. Today I have a quick video about this Hanwei Masamune Katana that I got secondhand from sword friend Robert, and that's one of the important things you know before you hear me talk about this sword is that it is secondhand, and I believe sword friend Robert actually got it from Cult of Athena on a scratch and dent sale. What that means to you is that this sword, this example, may not be 100% representative of what you would expect were you to buy one new yourself. Additionally, note that I'm not an expert and well, take what I say with a grain of salt. This review is just my thoughts and opinions, and so hopefully the video, if you were to mute it, is photographically sufficient to help you determine if you want to buy one of these or not. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the sword now. The first thing to note is aesthetically, I like the theme. That's really a subjective thing whether you like it or not, but I like that nothing about the sword inherently pulls my eye one way or another. It's kind of plain Jane aesthetically, but I like that it doesn't stand out in the dojo if you're using it, and it, I suppose, looks pretty enough if you like this kind of thing. Anyway, that's all subjective. The main thing I want to point out is that I just don't know much about Date Masamune. When I was reading the description for this sword, that's really the first bit I learned about Date Masamune. So the thing is, the fittings to me appear to be a hodgepodge. We have a dragon, but it's a one-eyed dragon, and supposedly the one-eyed dragon is Masamune's nickname here. We have bits of armor for the Menuki, some Moan, and another bird over here, and then the general holding his war fan, and then some troops with matchlocks or rifles of some kind on the other end. Anyway, to me it appears to be some goofy amalgam of fittings, but that's because it's telling a story about a historical figure I know nothing about, so I don't know how to really gauge the story. Anyway, the fittings themselves are something that I'll talk about in a moment, and we can look at them individually. But thematically speaking, it's just ignorance on my part. I can't tell you if I like it or not because I don't know the fairy tale, I don't know the story, and that's mostly ignorance on my part. Anyway, Hanwei is pretty trustworthy about making fitting sets that make sense and thematically go together, so I'll have to kind of hope that they did that here as well. Maybe you know more, throw it in the comments down below. I don't know enough about the historical figure to tell you if these go together, but maybe you do. Anyway, let's talk about the individual fittings. The first thing I talk about is the kasha here. We have a one-eyed dragon, and the first thing I'm going to note about the one-eyed dragon is that this is kind of the muddiest of the fittings. It's the one that I suppose has the least detail, and it's still reasonably detailed. There's a one-eyed dragon for sure, but it took me a minute to recognize where the dragon was as I was trying to get this footage. And so out of all the fittings, this is the one that seems to stand out as the least clean of them. Overall, though, it's still reasonably well done. It has shitodome that appear to be separate as opposed to cast in, and the overall casting quality on the kasha is reasonably well. You can certainly tell it's a one-eyed dragon if you look at it. The ledges where it transitions to the ito are not necessarily great. I can get my finger in there. It's not wonderful, and the transition, it has goofy ledges, and it just looks, well, it doesn't look the greatest. Anyway, the kasha itself is pretty, and I suppose the one-eyed dragon is Masamune's nickname, but anyway, irregardless, there we go. There's the kasha. Now I'm going to talk about the ska, the grip, the handle, and I'm going to start with the ito. And there's one major concern here, and that is that the ito doesn't alternate. This style of maki, I believe is Hinari maki, I'm not entirely sure, but the ito doesn't alternate in terms of which little braid passes over. Usually one will pass this way than the other in terms of which layer is on the top. What that means, I suppose, is that if the kasha comes off, or the ito loosens, or the knot comes undone, it can come unraveled very, very quickly, which is another concern because the ito is not particularly tight. It's not the loosest ito I've felt, but there are spots that are tighter and spots that are looser. So if this were not to come undone, or the kasha were to come off, it will unravel very quickly, which is a little bit of a concern, though that hasn't happened yet. What I can say on a positive for the ito is that texturally it feels very nice. It has a nice suede feeling. It absorbs oil from your hands pretty quickly, but that kind of gives it just a more rugged, aged look, and I personally don't mind it. Anyway, the ito itself doesn't have very clean diamonds. They run the gambit all over the place, and the shape, well, it's not necessarily terribly axe-handly, which is what Hanwei can be known for. It does just look a little misshapen. Directionally, it just doesn't line up the way it's supposed to, and some of the ito kind of seems to bunch or just not really be laid as well as it could. The samegao underneath here appears to be of a reasonably nice quality. It's got a nice skin, but I can make out the panels on the wood. Now, sword friend Robert did a review on this sword as well, and I'm finding much the same thing that he had to say. The Menuki on here are the next bit that I'd like to point out, and detail-wise, these are really, really detailed and really quite good. I really like the overall casting quality of the Menuki. and I think they kind of stand out as a testament of what Hanwei's casting quality really can be. There's just a lot of fine detail that's preserved in these Minukis. There's a chest plate here, and I can just make out a ton of detail in the casting, which is great. A lot of times the casting from other companies tends to be cartoony or really lackluster. It doesn't preserve the level of detail that you see in Hanwei's here. These are really quite well done. We'll move on to the Fucci. Again, this Fucci stands out as very nice. I like the patina, the overall coloration, and while I don't think it necessarily goes with the one-eyed dragon on the other side, again, call that my ignorance, I do really appreciate, again, the level of detail that I can see in here. There are just things that are preserved, and overall how well it's colored. I like this gold touch as well. Again, a lot of manufacturers, when they put gold on, or they're mixing different colors and patinas, it tends to look like finger painting, and this looks like it's done with some level of precision, and I think the fittings are one of the most redeeming qualities of this sword overall. Anyway, the downside of the Fucci is that it doesn't line up necessarily this way. There's a ledge, I can get my fingernail on it, and it does chew on my hand if I choke towards the Tsuba up here as I hold the sword. It kind of rubs on my finger and causes a little bit of discomfort. Nothing in the swing, it's not as though I'm bleeding or it cut me or anything like that, but it is an uncomfortable feeling. Still, the handle itself, I should note, is very comfortable to hold, swing, it's easy to get purchased with. Sword friend Robert noted that these kind of diamonds raise up and it gives you a secure feeling in the hand. I can certainly agree that that's the case, though it does feel like it moves around in my hand a little bit, which gives me a less than secure feeling. The Tsuba is Date Masamune, and there are some things I like and don't like about the Tsuba. Starting with the not like, one, the reverse side has some people fighting with rifles or matchlocks, or so I don't exactly know what's going on, but the details are quite a bit muddier on one side of the Tsuba than the other. Now, this is the general holding his war fan, presumably providing some direction, and the casting quality, the detail is really quite good here. The use of color is quite good and reasonably well executed for a sword in this price point. And again, the fittings overall, at least in terms of how well they're done, is one of the main redeeming things I like about this. I would say that I think the one side of the Tsuba is not necessarily as clean as the other, but the side that you show to the world is this one. And it overall looks quite good. Proportionally though, it seems a little bit of a miss. I don't know if it's just not, I don't know what it is about it aesthetically that just proportionally seems odd to me, but nevertheless, it's still a well done Tsuba, and the characteristics and details on it are reasonably clean. We'll talk about the saya now. There's not a whole lot to say. It's a simple Ishime kind of splatter pattern or stone pattern saya, and it does the job. It's got a horn koiguchi, kurigata, and kojiri. The kojiri is a little bit more square. I find that this tends to be harder to fit in my obi, but not necessarily too terribly so. It's nothing from a user perspective stands out as bad about it. Honestly, it feels good in my hand. It slides around in the belt reasonably well. It doesn't show fingerprints a lot. It doesn't look overly blingy and weird when you're trying to practice with it. I didn't get the Sageo with this, but it does look like the kurigata. It doesn't have any cracks, and it's made out of a nice horn with some interesting patterns and things like that in it. And the saya doesn't rattle too much, at least not for how bad it could be. The sword still holds in the saya reasonably well, and pressure-wise is fit about the way it should be, though that is subject to change with the weather and use and all sorts of other factors. Now we can talk about the blade, and unfortunately this is the part that most people are interested in, and it's the part I have the least to say because there's not a whole lot to honestly talk about here. The blade is made out of a type of steel that Hanwei uses. I can't exactly recollect what it is, but it seems really similar to the Hanwei Practical Sword, or it's the same material made from the Hanwei Practical Sword, which means it's a tried and true and well-tested steel that Hanwei is familiar with working with, and it produces a really good sword. I've used the sword, I've done some bad cuts with it, and it's still straight, it's not twisted, it's still sharp, it doesn't have any issues with the edge, other than obviously it's got some scratches on it from the tatami mats that it's cut, and from the scratches that it came with from Sword friend Robert, who also, I believe, cut with the sword. Anyway, from a polish perspective, it's really lackluster. It doesn't have a really refined polish. On the plus side, if you're planning on using it, you're less disappointed when the polish inevitably diminishes in quality because of the cutting scratches that are kind of involved in the process of cutting. But it does have some aesthetically endearing qualities, I suppose. It's got a hamon on it that you can make out in the right light. It shows up with the etch that Hanwei uses, despite the kind of roughness of the polish. The yukote is there, even though it's really rough and just appears to be generally sanded on. And the overall profile of the sword is nice. It reminds me a lot of a Hanwei Practical. I mean, I don't know if geometrically speaking these are different from the Hanwei Practical. I would suspect maybe in some way they are. This feels a little bit more tip heavy than a Hanwei Practical, a little heavier maybe in general, but overall it really feels like a Hanwei Practical with finer fittings and a different fit and finish, a different set of clothes put on the sword, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's certainly a handsome sword with some endearing qualities. The thing is, this isn't a terribly expensive sword. At $370 from Call to Athena, you can't necessarily expect a whole lot, and for what it's intended to be, something that has some aesthetically pleasing characteristics to sit on your wall, or something for use with maybe a little more bedazzlement or a different theme than a Hanwei Practical, I'm not expecting anything more than what I'm getting right here. It seems perfectly fine. Now I'll talk about the dynamics of the sword, and this is where I guess I can't remember what Hanwei Practical feels like, but it's got a little bit of tip heft to it. I'll include links to the weapon dynamic computer below, and I will include in the description the dimensions and all that kind of stuff. Speaking of dimensions, Hanwei really got close on their website to what actually this sword is. It's with a lot of rarity that the measurements on the website are as close to the sword in the hand as this is. Now that might just be the example that I have. I don't know if they're all like that, given that I only have this one, but it is a special tip of the hat to say the measurements on the website actually match the sword that I got. Anyway, dynamically speaking, the sword is not so bad to move around. It seems well balanced if for an all-around usage. Whether you're doing cutting with it, it has enough rigidity and enough, I don't know, enough presence to really do Japanese tatami mat cutting, if that's your thing. I used it for that. Didn't necessarily excel at it, but it certainly did the job. And if I'm using it for noto or yaito, basically if we're doing kata or yaito, it's fine. It doesn't necessarily, it's not light, it's not something I'd want to use for hours on end, and it doesn't have the same sense of refinement as a nice Tazando Iaito does, but it does the job and it's fine. It fits together and overall isn't a miserable experience, and it feels reasonably good in the hands as well. It seems to be a good balance of, if you only have one sword to do everything, this isn't necessarily bad, but it's a little heavier than I'd say you might want if you're doing a lot of Iaito. Anyway, dynamically speaking, what I think about it is really subjective. The weapon dynamics computer will hopefully tell you if it's going to be a good fit for you or not. Anyway, I swung it around through the seasons. The other thing I should note is that conditionally, it seemed to hold up pretty well. I used it outside in the winter, used it outside in the summer, and really not much has changed. The Ito is loose, sort of, when I got it, and it stayed about the same, sort of. And the saya has held up. It didn't, through expansion and contraction, there may have been some differences, but really nothing worth noting specifically. Condition-wise, it's really held up. It hasn't developed any rattles or issues, even after the cutting and stuff. Now, speaking of cutting, I'll talk about that now. The cutting I mostly did was use Japanese tatami mats. They're tough to cut, at least as far as tatami goes. And the sword didn't do the work for me. If I didn't kind of throw my weight into it, if I didn't use the sword and cut with intent, it didn't make it through the sword. And use Japanese tatami is stiffer stuff than, say, a beach mat or some of the other tatami varieties out there. It's among them. It's the tougher stuff. So I really did have to use the sword and technique to make it through the tatami mat. But it cut cleanly. The edge is still sharp, and it's held up well. It's not a bad cutter, but it didn't necessarily do all the work for me, which some swords out there have certainly done. Anyway, overall, do I think it's worth it or not? I suppose that's the next question. A better question to answer might be, do I think this sword's a ripoff? And to that, I can certainly say no. I don't think it's a ripoff at all. In fact, I hold the practical line in really high regard from Hanwei. There's several different models, and to me, this just fits among the practical line. It's got additional details and fittings and suede on the handle, but it seems pretty much like a Hanwei practical sword to me, with some additional features that cost additional money. And if you find value in them, the details and the fittings or the suede on the handle, then I'd say it's worth your money. The thing is that, honestly, it's overall a good sword. It just doesn't strike a chord with me personally from an aesthetic standpoint, and the suede doesn't persuade me, if you will, to spend more money. I'd rather spend my money on Hanwei Practical, which is about $50 cheaper. If you want the detail and the fittings, suede on the handle, then I go that way. To me personally, though, the non-alternating pattern on the Ito is a concern, and it's also kind of haphazardly done. And if I'm going to get haphazardly done Ito, I'd rather spend less money on it. The Hanwei Practical is really similar in proportion, though it is noted that it's different. I would just say, all things being equal, I would still rather have a Hanwei Practical. The theme is a little bit more generic, and while it has less detail in the fittings, it strikes a chord with me more than this one does. But that's not to say that the Date Masamune theme won't strike a chord with somebody. Anyway, those are my thoughts on if the sword is worth it or not. And to me, it's just, no, I'd rather have a Hanwei Practical. But if you're a person that wants one sword to do everything, and one of those things is going to be harder target cutting, like green bamboo or used Japanese tatami mats, this isn't a bad sword. At a little over 2 pounds, 9 ounces, it's got a tip presence that hopefully the Weapon Dynamics computer has explained. It feels pretty good. I could use this for doing kata for a while and not get super tired, though it would be a bit of a strain. It's on a little above medium side in terms of weight, and in terms of distribution, it's a little bit of work to get it out there. But it also has the profile to do some harder target cutting and hold up. I used it, it's still straight, it's a good sword. And if you have one sword to do all of those tasks, one of those tasks being harder target cutting, this isn't necessarily a bad choice. I personally prefer using a variety of swords to cut the type of target that I want to cut, or to practice whatever I'm going to be practicing. I don't have one sword to rule them all, so to speak. But if you do, and that's your choice, then this wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing to look at. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I hope they've helped. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.